Greg Endres. I work as Extension Agronomist at the Carrington REC Center. So this morning, I will focus my discussion on plant establishment. Before I do so, I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about some of the pros and cons with dry bean production and marketing. And I think this will be especially useful for people that are newer to dry bean production, but maybe a good review too for those of you that are experienced. So there's lots of pros, as you can see. Certainly dry beans can be adapted to many regions in our area. Certainly they will do better with arid conditions, drier conditions, but not to the point that we had last year, well, certainly. And then they do well on well-drained soil, as well as low salt soils. Certainly there's profit potential. That's why there's so much interest, of course, this year. Each year, NDSU Extension puts together crop budgets, and I looked at the Northeast region of the state and compared the return on labor and management with dry beans versus soybean. And there was an advantage with the dry bean in this case, and they were using fairly conservative numbers, but it translated to about a $70 per acre advantage with dry bean versus soybean. Crop rotation, dry beans would be a very nice substitute for other legumes such as pulses or in this region, certainly soybean. Another advantage is timing of planting. Dry bean fit very nicely into rotations that would include some type of small grain and corn and soybean for that matter, both with timing of planting as well as harvest. Dave Franson will talk about plant nutrition, but in general, fertilizer fertilizer needs is fairly modest with dry bean. And then direct harvest, the acreage is growing with direct harvest, which is good. Certainly, we can point to our genetics for this, as well as ground rolling. And then with the cons, yes, there is a fair list there to consider. One is that there are increased direct costs compared to soybeans, for example. If we go back to the Northeast North Dakota crop budget guide, they're showing direct costs of about $80 per acre more as compared to soybean. Plant establishment typically is a little more challenging with dry bean versus soybean. Certainly dry bean have lower level of stress tolerance. With weed control, it's a challenge for full season weed control with dry bean. One big reason is that it's difficult to reach the full canopy and provide good competition of the dry bean with weeds. And then certainly another one is that we just have limited number of herbicides. We have them, but we'd certainly like more to help with managing the weeds. Sam Markell, our extension plant pathologist, will be on later this morning, and he certainly will be highlighting the challenges we have with disease management. And so that follows to, there's numerous sprayer passes in a field because of crop protection needs as well as desiccation before harvest. And certainly expect more sprayer passes with dry bean as compared to many of our other crops. At harvest time, there's certainly challenges. There's higher potential for seed loss compared to soybean. The seed is fragile. Oftentimes specialized equipment is used. And timeliness is very important. And sometimes we have fairly narrow windows for harvest to maintain the seed quality, certainly compared to other crops such as soybean. And then marketing, we need to achieve food grade quality. If we don't, there's discounts or possibly not even be able to market the crop for human food. And then overall, it requires contracts most typically, and then delivery is a little more limited as compared to our common commodity crops such as corn, wheat, or soybean. So again, just an overview to provide a background for my talk as well as others that are following this morning. So let's get to the matter at hand, and that is plant establishment. So I have 5 subjects I'd like to talk about. They include crop sequence, planting dates, plant populations and row spacings, minimum stands, and then rye as a preceding cover crop. So I'll be going through these fairly rapidly because of limited time this morning. And so let's get started. So crop sequencing. The question to ask is, what is the impact of previously grown cash crops on dry bean seed yield and quality for that matter? Hans already alluded to the dry bean grower survey that NDSU Extension does with North Harvest each year. And very recently, we just were able to publish the results from the 2021 grower survey. And so in the survey, we ask about what is your previous crop? And so this is a display of the table compiled from the responses of people in the North Harvest area, that'd be Minnesota as well as North Dakota. And so this table shows individual year responses to what was the previous crop before the 2021 dry bean crop. And then most importantly would be the 4-year average. And so not surprisingly, corn and wheat predominated as the crops that were grown before dry bean, about 70%. But to my surprise, and probably to many other people, is that dry bean was in third place. In fact, just based on the respondents, over 20% of the folks did grow dry bean on dry bean residue. And then rounding up, the top 4 was soybean. So to provide some background information on the impact of the previous crop, we're going to go to Manitoba. This is data from Manitoba showing the response of various crops. And in this case, they had dry bean as part of the mix, the response to the previous crop residue. This was about a 10-year average of data from Manitoba and on large fields. And so if we look at navy beans, those preceding crops where the data shown in green shows that there was a positive response by the dry bean. So yes, we'd expect having spring wheat as the preceding crop would be positive for dry bean production. And the same would be true with corn and barley. Also note that when beans were grown on bean ground, that there was a substantial loss in yield compared to yield potential with grass crops. And then it's also interesting in this database that canola and oats were put downward pressure on yield potential as well as preceding crops. So the story here is be careful about your crop rotation. If you have choices, certainly a grass crop preceding dry bean will provide some higher yield potential. Move on to a little bit on planting dates. Hans talked about that briefly with his experience last year in a trial. All right, so this is a chart or a graph that shows planting progress last year based on ag statistics. And so with the earliest spring last year, people had the opportunity, if they wished, to maybe plant dry beans a little earlier than normal. And so by mid-May, according to the estimates, there was close to 20% of the dry beans in the ground. And then the last half of May progressed as we would pretty well expect. By the first 10 days in June, we were at over 90% of the beans in the ground. This graph shows NDON data on minimum daily temperatures. And as I'm sure everyone recalls, we had a hard frost in late May on May 28th. So how does that translate to those early planted dry beans last year? I suspect it was not a good scenario. So that leads to a little bit on planting date. The question is there any advantage by planting earlier than normal on seed yield or maybe quality? And so we explored that through a series of trials in the state by NDSU, primarily at Carrington and Prosper. And this table shows data from when we had the opportunity to plant the trials rather early. And so we worked actually with 3 market types. Notice the definition of early, normal, and late planting. And so to get to the summary, the average across the market types and the varieties, we did not see any yield advantage by planting early as compared to the normal time, which would be the last 10 days of May through the first 10 days in June. And so I think the This is something to consider, and the people that are using the traditional strategy, planting the last 7 to 10 days in May and into the early part of June, that continues to be a good strategy. Also in this database, we looked at other things. We did not see any advantage with plant lodging or reducing plant lodging by planting early, as well as seed size and seed quality. All those were not impacted in this study with early planting. And if you want more details, we do have a publication that will provide those. Okay, next item would be, let's talk a bit about plant populations and row spacing. We're in particular interested in the interaction of those and how it may positively impact dry bean production. As a background for this discussion, I want to mention that I'll be showing you data from agronomic studies, and white mold was essentially absent. We could find it occasionally, but it had no impact on yield in these studies. Dr. Michael Wunsch, plant pathologist at Carrington, his work over the last decade has emphasized white mold management in row crops, including dry bean. And at this point, he has summarized that with dry bean, including pinto bean, that with narrow rows, if we use narrow rows over time, we can see an advantage on yield gains compared to wide rows, assuming that we have lower environments for white mold and we manage white mold properly, including using the correct fungicide, using the correct timing for the fungicide application, and the correct size spray droplets. And then the other point is economics. The data I'll show you should be fairly convincing that narrow rows are a nice management strategy. But we're assuming that existing equipment is available to plant intermediate rows. If that's not the case, you need to purchase new equipment. Then you need to carefully scrutinize the numbers in order to make that decision of moving to narrow rows. Okay, so with all that discussion in mind, let's move into the data. So we emphasize the combination of the two factors, plant population and row spacings. We started that work with black bean and navy beans. And so this is the data on black bean that we conducted. It was 4 set years of data conducted at Carrington, and we did not see a yield response with the various row spacings that we investigated. Maybe some trends, but statistically no difference in yield amongst the row spacings. And then with plant populations, the story was the same. We had targeted stands, or actual stands shown, point that out right here, of 100,000, about just under 120, and then all the way up to 140. And statistically, well, essentially no yield response, even with the very high plant populations. Again, with black bean in a fair number of studies. But the story was different with navy beans. In a 3 site year database at Carrington, we saw a nice response with narrow rows, actually when we got down to 14 inches, and then also when we had early season established plant populations of over 115,000. We saw a nice yield response as compared to wider rows and lower plant populations. And if you want more details about the studies with black and navies, this is the publication that you can review the information. And then we've been doing work, of course, with pinto beans. This is some data conducted in the eastern part of the state, where we examined 12, 18, and 30-inch rows and their response or impact on yield. And what we found was that 18-inch rows performed very well. There was 10% higher yield compared to the 12-inch rows, and there was actually a 14% yield advantage average over the years compared to the wide rows. And then a larger database, this is 10 site years of data at the 3 locations listed, Carrington, Langdon, and Minot, and as well as the years of the tests. And it was clear that we did have a yield advantage with the intermediate row spacing compared to the wide rows. And primarily the row spacings in the intermediate range were from 18 to 22 inch. There's only one trial, and that was at Minot, where they went down to 15-inch rows. And then how about plant populations? Well, we'll go downward from the standard, which has been 70,000 plants established early in the season. So in this case, this is 6 years of data at the locations and years listed in the title. And notice that when we went down to about 50,000 plants, we lost some yield to the tune of about 6% compared to near the 70,000. Well, how about going the other way? When we went up to the upper 80s for plant population, we saw an average yield increase, average over 3 site years at the 2 locations and across the years of about 5% compared to the standard. So this slide shows a summary of the 3 market types. And with pinto beans, we're still analyzing the data. But to this point, with preliminary data, we're certainly finding that the intermediate row spacing combined with a plant population of very likely greater than 80,000 will optimize yields. And again, remember the assumptions that we had that where we've adequately managed white mold. And so we will be putting the end to our investigation on the pinto work during the next few months. So moving on, Hans and I just recently revised a publication called Replanting or Late Planting Crops. And you can search the web for this by using the keywords NDSU crop replanting. So within this guide, we have a table that shows the minimum stands suggested by NDSU and includes information on navy black as well as pinto beans. So a rule of thumb that we have is that we could actually go down to 40 to 50% of a normal stand and maybe still be okay. But that's assuming that we have somewhat of a uniform plant density out there. And that may not be a correct assumption in many cases. Oftentimes we don't have that uniform stand. There might be large areas that have very few plants. And so that's the challenge on determining whether to replant or not. But where I'm going with this conversation is shown in this graph. Through the years at Carrington, when we conducted production management trials with dry beans, sometimes we don't achieve that optimum of around 70,000 And so I found those trials where we had less than that, and I graphed those that had less than early season plant stand of less than 50,000 plants per acre. So there were 7 of those trials, and note last year we had 2 of them. Of course, last year all the rules were broken, and as you suspect, we had very low yields with those 2 2021 trials. So let's look at the other 5 trials. We had a range of plant populations established from 32,000 to about 49,000. And in these cases, we had certainly an acceptable yield. And notice that with this trial, establishing 47,000 plants, we had exceptional yields. So the simple story is that we can achieve some very adequate yields with less than optimum plant populations, but it does require more management. Certainly, weed management is going to be more of a challenge. And then with these lower plant populations, very likely we're going to have more variability with plant growth stages. And that poses challenge throughout the season, but especially at harvest time when we make preparations for having an efficient harvest. And then the very last subject I'd like to talk about on plant establishment is the use of cover crops preceding dry bean production. And for me, a very good goal to have would be to reduce or eliminate what's pictured here, reducing soil erosion. With cover crops, some other advantages that we could realize is helping with weed suppression in dry beans. It may help with managing excessive soil moisture, and certainly would help to contribute to long-term soil productivity and maybe even increase in soil productivity. And so with that in mind, we started a study back in 2017 to answer some of the questions that people have regarding using winter rye as a preceding cover crop in dry bean. And those basic questions were, can we maintain yield with this production system? When's the best time to terminate rye? And does rye actually help us with weed management in crops, including dry bean? And so this is a look at the treatments that we have in last year's trial, and the treatments that we included in the study throughout the actually 5-year period included treatments number 1 through 5, and then also treatment number 7. And the treatments were defined based on the termination timing of the rye where we use glyphosate. And so I'll briefly talk about those. So treatment number 1 was we tried to mimic a conventional production system. And so we terminated the rye with tillage, primarily the preceding fall, or we did it early spring. And then we used glyphosate to clean up any escapes, either pre-plant applied or as a pre-emergence application. In addition, we did use a pre-emergence herbicide. And one example was we used Spartan Elite. So that was our conventional check. So in comparison, we had treatments 2 through 4, where we terminated the rye anywhere from 2 weeks to 5 weeks before the dry beans are planted. Last year, the dry beans were planted on June 2nd. And then the last treatments, in particular 5 and 7, we planted the pinto beans into living rye and then terminated the rye, in this case, the day of planting. And then treatment number 7, we waited as long as we could before the beans started emerging to apply the glyphosate to terminate the rye. And so by now you notice that this was the yield from the various treatments, and last year was certainly a difficult year. So we saw very little differences amongst the treatments for yield. But how about over the years? What are some of our conclusions based on the questions we asked? So the very first question was, can we maintain yield using this system of rye as a preceding cover crop in pinto beans? And my answer, based on the study, is yes. Notice that we did have similar yields as long as we terminated the rye prior to bean planting, anywhere from at least 2 weeks before all the way up to 5 weeks before the beans were planted. So very good yields and very similar to the conventional check. So the next question was, when's the best time to terminate the rye? All through the study, all the years, we always had a challenge with dry periods before the bean planting and after. And thus, when we allowed the rye to grow and use moisture up to planting time, it did negatively impact the pinto bean production. And so our recommendations, if you have a dry planting period with dry beans, is to be careful about that and I'd suggest being conservative on timings when you terminate the rye. If there's any question, terminate the rye early versus late. So in this case, when we average the yields from these treatments, all pre-plant termination of the rye, we averaged about 20% better yield compared to planting green, or in other words, when the rye was terminated at planting time or after. And the last question is weed management. And we have information. Dr. Joe Eichley will be on later on this morning, and he'll, I assume, be covering this information in his presentation. So if you want details about this, Hans and I just finished writing and publishing a new circular that addresses the strategy of using rye as a preceding cover crop for pinto bean. And so with that, that's prepared information that I'd like to visit with you about on plant establishment.